Hello and welcome to the fourth and final Igniter event as part of the ABCD programme for cultural recovery. If you've missed the other three, don't worry, it's all been recorded. This has been a brilliant series of conversations, discussions, thought-provoking, challenging, really great. So if you've missed them, don't worry, we will tell you how you can catch up. But that little video you just saw was a brief intro into the ABCD programme, a unique and collaborative methodology of grassroots-led cultural recovery and innovation in Brighton and Hove and the surrounding district. The Igniter events were created to support and ensure the creative industries come out of this pandemic stronger than they went into it, despite some of the challenges they have faced. Challenge feels like an overused word in the last 2 years, doesn't it? But you know, I'm forever trying to see optimism of what we've gone through and what we can learn from. For a start, we wouldn't have had events like this. We would all have been together in a room, and as you'll discover, our speakers aren't all in this country. So let's take some benefits of this, that we can have international conversations that benefit globally. You know, we've seen a lot of Zoom, but we'll take our positives. We also look forward to seeing you all in person coming up soon as well. But the team at Always Possible, of which I'm a member, my name is Lucy Paine, a member of the Always Possible team. We've always been excited to curate these events, bringing together local, national and international speakers to explore, provoke, challenge and celebrate creativity in all its forms, which will be a part of this discussion. Creativity is such a broad sentence, isn't it? What does that mean? We're looking at Brighton as a bit of a microcosm, but we welcome everyone involved, and hopefully we can share some insight from the wider lens and unpick what it is to be a part of the creative industry in the 21st century. Now, this is an interactive event. We have a fantastic series of speakers. So the format for this event is we have 4 speakers who are going to speak to us for 15-20 minutes on different topics. Do feel free to ask them questions as we go through, and then we'll open up to a panel discussion where we're going to be joined by 2 more members of our panel to enhance that conversation. So our panel and speakers will be asking questions of each other. We want you to put questions into the put it into the chat, because obviously in here we have chat and Q&A. Pop it all in chat so I can keep an eye on it. And we just want these next 2 hours to fly by, inspire you, challenge you, make you want to get involved. That's what we're going for these next 2 hours. So make sure you've had your cup of tea. It's a bit late for coffee. Get your cup of tea, get settled and get involved. So thank you all for joining us. And Cissie, thank you. Can we start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for having me. Really glad to be joining everybody from Brighton. Hopefully we will have some international participants as well. And mainly because I am one such participant in this discussion. I am Cissie Fu. I work at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, which is based in Vancouver, Canada. So in fact, I do have my coffee with me because it is just a little bit past 9:30 in the morning here on the West Coast of North America. And as I contemplate what the conversation can be moving forward for Brighton, let me share where I am. This is a wood carving of a human portrait mask by a First Nations artist based in British Columbia. His name is Dempsey Bob, and this is the image that perhaps captures best how I am feeling right now on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. Over here on the West Coast, and especially in Canada, as we focus on questions of, if you will, structural change. The kinds of actions and the kind of creativity and the kind of courage that we need to really recognize all the differences that the land holds, but really the erasures of peoples, of traditions, of languages. It really casts perhaps a wider sight on what cultural recovery can mean. So as I listened to all of the previous sessions, I would like to first encourage us to think about what cultural recovery means to each of us in the audience as well as on the panel. So if you would like to share that in the chat, if you already have a definition, or if you more excitingly find that your definition is moving as you listen to the people around you, to the place that you are at, to those things that you hold dear, and the values that will be shaping what can become a type of recovery for Brighton. Please bear in mind that there are very many ways in which culture can be defined widely and also narrowly, whether it requires us to be compassionate, creative, or commercial. That's a conversation from the previous session. To whether a new resilience for Greater Brighton actually requires us, as Sophie Cook mentioned 2 sessions ago, to build a new extraordinary, that cultural recovery is not about returning to a normal. And then right at the very beginning of the entire series, does Brighton dare, when Alex Parker encouraged us to be more pirate. These are ways in which I am hoping to offer a few comments, a few examples around the world of what it means for us to shift between an evolution and a revolution, as Wana Udobang encouraged us to think in the last session, what mutual aid and broad-based collaboration can mean, and what it means to commit to compassion, a suffering with that is also attuned to a kind of tenderness. With that, I want to offer first, maybe a little bit of a balm, if you will, since these are tender times. What you see here is an animation, a panel taken from a documentary that I would talk a little about regarding what artists can do in the city for structural change. It is taken from the ways in which perhaps ideas can grow and be fostered, that roots and nutrients, fungi and bacteria, viruses even, could be nurturing, that difference, sometimes shock, sometimes systemic, sometimes not, could actually launch us into a braver space such that we confront what it is that has not been working. So if what has previously happened actually didn't really achieve that which would benefit all, what kind of a future can we look to? So as we think about plants, and then think about the ways in which we are all perhaps connected, and we think about stories and the understory of a culture, and what makes a culture. Here is a quote drawn from Baranda Montgomery's Lessons from Plants. Recently published, Baranda is one of the very few recognized Black botanists in the US. And the quote itself is drawn from Amy Leach's Things That Are. So the quote goes, "Desire makes plants very brave, so they can find what they desire, and very tender, so they can feel what they find." I hope that as we continue to think about resilience, that we recognize what it takes to feel, that in this time and age when things are perhaps a bit bleak, that we can take courage from each other and also to feel and to think in terms of desires, perhaps, rather than risks. And as we find a language to move from the transactional language of capital, and the very many ways in which our societies are organized, and the ways in which our cities perhaps speak of industries and economies, that we be patient with transactional language so that we could transition into a transformative language. And I would propose that art, design, media, creativity, imagination is what will guide us through this transition into something transformative. This is something front of mind for me at the moment. So a tender moment, if you would allow me that. I am originally from Hong Kong, born there, and has moved geographically eastward to Vancouver, where I am now in Canada, then east again to the east coast of the US for my schooling, undergraduate, then moved across east again, across the Atlantic, did my graduate work in the UK, and then stayed around Europe a tiny bit, also moving a tiny bit east from the UK to take up my first position at a comprehensive university in the Netherlands. What I have found as I am oddly moving back westward and having visited my parents in Hong Kong just recently, with flights delayed and flights canceled, with various new happenings, if you will, in Hong Kong. What I'm sharing is a photograph from the 63rd floor where my parents live in a rather large estate that has been undergoing all sorts of COVID protocols. And over the weekend, in a very rare moment, there was an earthquake in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not located in an earthquake zone. The earthquake is quite mild, only shook parts of Hong Kong. What I hear is that children and animals were much more attuned to the shaking, which happened at around 2:30 a.m. in the morning. Those of us who have been following what has been happening in Hong Kong since the 2014 umbrella movement and the 2019 anti-extradition law movement, and the ways in which the creative economy industry, if you will, but also the ways in which expression has been confined, might feel some resonance with this photograph, which is the calm, the very gloomy calm before a typhoon. that all said, if we're thinking about the ways in which structures need to change in order to allow for new beginnings, I'd like to share another quote. This is from Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition, a German Jewish poet who also famously wrote about the origins of totalitarianism. And in a more optimistic moment, echoing Lucy, she wrote, "Power is actualized where words are not empty and deeds are not brutal. Where words are not used to veil intentions, but to disclose realities, and deeds are not used to violate and destroy, but to establish relations and create new realities." Action in the world is completely coextensive with an expression of freedom. And so we move to greener pastures, moving back perhaps. This is an image from the 2014 umbrella movement in Hong Kong. In front of us are secondary school and university students who have in their moment of insistence and persistence and demonstration that there is power in coming together, that they have also not neglected their studies, that they're struggling together in the most undercommoning sense, if you will, per Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. Studies are not neglected, communities are built. The ways in which students then come together to learn are through teach-ins, mutual aid. And here I come back to something inspired by the very first session of the Igniter series. Insofar as we're thinking about culture, we're thinking perhaps about community. And I had the privilege of being Dean of the Faculty of Culture and Community at Emily Carr University of Art and Design these past 5 years. And what I've learned through collaborative action with students, with staff, with faculty, and also with external partners in and out of the city, what we're looking at and what we're striving towards perhaps are cultures of co-mutiny. Not so much to mutate, but mutiny coming from the Latin root for the word to move. So yes, rather piety to talk about mutiny, but at the same time, it is by moving together that we're able to change our reality, to create new ones perhaps. But perhaps the new is not so much about something that hasn't happened before, but a different way of placing people and, if you will, talents and skills, but really affinities and strivings, and right back to the very first quote that I mentioned, desires. A restructuring of those in the various roles that creative, imaginative people can play. So, insofar as we are talking about cultural recovery, given the pandemic, which inspired this series, provocation that I have for you today is to think of how creative practitioners and organization can conspire with public and private institutions to imagine and enact responsive and responsible futures. As pandemic conditions continue to suspend business as usual and catalyze operational and structural reconsiderations across the board, let's draw from a few recent moves in Canada, the Netherlands, and Hong Kong to support the current conscientious and collaborative rethink in Greater Brighton. So from resource sharing partnerships and mutual aid programs to educational initiatives to municipal innovations, cultural producers not only drive the recovery of creative economies, but also play pivotal roles in the evaluation and re-evaluation, and most crucially, the rewiring of social and political processes towards creating more resilient and sustainable publics. So here follows a few examples of what I have witnessed, sometimes directly, sometimes from afar. So first, I am sharing a few links here coming from the city of Calgary. This is a watershed public art experiment as organized by art collective Sans Façon. This is an artistic duel between Scotland and Calgary. After a series of consultations and this is a little bit earlier, from 2013 to 2014, the utilities and engineering parts of the city of Calgary actually embedded one artist in residence per segment of the department. Not so much for artists to do graphic illustration or to make something presentable visually, but rather to actually have artists listen and participate in decision-making processes. Really taking seriously the ways in which art and design education contributes to a different kind, I would argue a more robust kind of critical thinking, which is less about a direct communication of particular points of views, which tend to bind us to binaries or ideologies. We might be a little bit sick now of thinking about how the stasis in the left and the violence of the right actually pull at the creative and other economies in different ways. There might be stock arguments about what fascism does and what communism does and what democracy is supposed to do. And there are also misunderstandings of how liberalism is neutral. It isn't. So the ways in which art and artistic education actually allows for the communication that is responsive, that can embrace ambiguity, encourage contradiction and complexity, always idiosyncratic. With that voice in the mix of decision-making within traditionally data-driven and projection-driven departments, different things actually happened. So what you find are links about the project itself and the ways in which public art in Calgary has shifted because of this collaboration and embedding of artists within the city itself. And also a documentation, so a book that was published, which has a whole set of interviews, consultations with engineers, as well as with the general public. This is an interesting example of how artists and designers and media artists and creatives could actually elicit structural change by thinking outside of when given the right conditions. The training and the skills and the upskilling and all the micro-credentialing that is happening around the world given the pandemic at universities, to actually think of how oneself as a person could contribute to a conversation that is political. In this context, I also want to share that what I witnessed in Hong Kong in January and February 2022 was that some artists who have successfully ran and stood for office has put perhaps or honed their creativity and their imagination towards community engagement. And that in itself had an impact as well. So insofar as structural change, where do we put ourselves as people who are traditionally trained in one way or another? I myself am trained as a political philosopher. How does that translate into settings of art and administration or art education? What can artists and designers do beyond thinking about the traditional ways or the conventional ways or the ways in which we have been trained in professional practice? How do we reach out and create new publics? And also come up with, therefore, the kind of new reality that Hannah Arendt has given us inspiration for. In the chat now is a set of links to something that I was very pleased to be a part of. This is something that is based in Vancouver, a collaboration between the Vancouver School Board and the Artist in Residence Studio program, which was set up by Maggie Milne Martins some years ago in order to address the lacuna of arts education in primary public schooling in the city of Vancouver. The second link itself, you will find an animated documentary which is part of a community engaged research initiative of which I was a part through the Artist in Residence Studio program. Through that program, Emily Carr University was able to place recent alumni into the school board in order to provide artist-centered arts education. So rather than perhaps the general education setting where primary school teachers would encourage students to express themselves by drawing anything, or a more craft-oriented way of activating making. The point is that artists themselves, especially social practice artists, actually already has a sense of how to engage community, connect students, young people to the land, to the ways in which we see differently, and therefore could draw different conclusions through our observations. So that criticality that comes through arts education comes through in this way. Critical not as embedded in criticism, but critical in that we don't take our surroundings for granted, that things can be otherwise, and that how we see and how broadly and expansively we live, and therefore make and think, has an impact in the world. I'm also going to share one more link. And this is an example from the city of Amsterdam. As I mentioned, I was in the Netherlands for about 6 years before I moved back to Canada. And this is something that, yeah, I think quite a vexed experience, if you will. And whatever is vexing to me and complex to me and conflictual to me always generates a lot of energy. If we all agree we don't really need to communicate in the way that we do, and we could just assume that there is agreement. Where there is disagreement, we actually get to expose and reveal our values and what we each hold at our core. So at the Open Space Contemporary Art Museum, there has been a very concerted effort to build a contemporary art space that is local to the Netherlands and local to Amsterdam, but at the same time really move against the predominantly white culture of that space. So once again, we might speak of decolonization as a returning of land, but decolonization could also come through institutional efforts, which are transitional. If you click on the link, you will find that the staff and the board and the volunteers and the interns are carefully composed in a way where the presence of particular experiences already guide the curatorial mission of the space. So rather than thinking about inclusion, decolonization, and diversity in a tokenistic way. And here I make an analogy to thinking of artists, designers, and creatives in a tokenistic way, right? This is a project that requires some imagination, creativity, but what is meant is actually something to look pretty and good and neat, right? Or messy in an interestingly aesthetic way, right? Not to instrumentalize artists, not to instrumentalize lived experience and people. I think coming full circle back to cultural recovery, perhaps that is something that I would like to emphasize. That culture is organic. It is generated by the people who are heard, who are invited to the table, and could voice what they think. Not based necessarily on their identity, whether it is skin deep, whether it is a lifetime of training. That we are primarily and fundamentally also people in the world who suffer. Right back to compassion and desire, which makes us creative, which makes us want to imagine a different world together. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. There are a lot of emotions coursing through my body this past while. Thank you very much for giving me the space to say a few words.
Oh, it's fantastic, Cissie. And I've made lots of notes, and I think emotional is true. It's the lessons from plants and the compassion and what cultural recovery means. You've covered so many topics. I've made so many notes. It was quite intense. I think that's probably the word I'm going to stay with. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Lucy.
And I will reiterate your question we said at the beginning, which is what does cultural recovery mean to everybody individually listening? I think everyone's so engrossed listening to you that they haven't put their comments in the chat. So please do that. That's an ask that remains, because we can come back to that after we've heard from all the speakers. But thank you so much for such a powerful opening. And next I've got Matt Hunter from PlusX. Welcome.
Hello.
I mean, we have a very broad range of speakers, so I don't know how you follow that, but you bring a different flavour and a different perspective, and that's the whole point of this.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I'm excited to share my perspective, but almost don't want to break the fantastic reflective mood that I think Cissie has created.
Yes.
But I think I will. But hopefully, it's a very different context for creativity, and I suppose that's the point about all of this: finding all the different places that creativity can find a voice. So I'm just going to share some slides. Oh. I think for some reason that's not worked. I'm just going to stop that. Try again. One more time.
Perfect.
Right, hopefully that's better. We can see it. Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk about collaboration. But collaboration to generate new ideas, I suppose, in the world of innovation, and how vital the contribution of creative practice is in that. And I think more than anything, for me, it's about really recognizing that we need to foster curiosity in each other's practices as the precursor to that collaboration, because collaboration is hard. And I suppose I was reflecting very much during Cissie's presentation also on how there are so many barriers to understanding, be it around sort of language or ideas or even values. And so collaboration, I think we have to reflect, is phenomenally hard, but very powerful when we get it right. My creative practice, I suppose, I was trained as a designer. So my creative practice very much focused on practical outcomes, you could say, more than self-expression. But these days, I struggle to know how to describe myself because perhaps, again, as Cissie was referring, I'm trained as a designer and it was my practice for 20 years. But these days, I suppose I think of myself as an innovator. And I'll explain more about that in a second. So someone focused on helping identify the great ideas that might improve the world around us, the lives that we live, but also helping to put those ideas into practice. So the good news, I think, is this is an important mission, is something that's increasingly seen as one where creative people are key. And really, to be frank, this was not always the case. In the 20th century, especially, we designers, I think, were historically sort of characterized as only interested in probably the rather superficial issues of vanity and consumption. And that's reasonable, perhaps, because so much of design was linked to industry and consumption. But then it was the scientists and the technologists and the financiers and the lawyers and the politicians who were perceived as those who had the authority to change the world. But I really do think that's different these days. I was 15 years at a company called IDEO, a global sort of design and innovation company. And we played our part. We helped to promote the idea of design thinking as a movement that could persuade business leaders and policymakers that this sort of human-centered form of creativity that is the best design was vital in solving some of the most important challenges and pressing challenges that we face. And then, of course, leading educators, promoted the idea, especially in North America, that the liberal arts, that might be represented by the letter A, must be added to the science, technology, engineering, and maths of STEM and to form STEAM. Or more recently in the UK, the concept of the creative industries, computer games, film, advertising, publishing, architecture. It's a pretty broad church, which pre-pandemic at least were growing faster than most other sectors. So this, of course, is nothing new. Brighton is the home of the Brighton Hughes research report of 2013, which sort of proved the power of fusing technology and creativity. Not a new idea, but still, I think it has been amazing how few people have widely understood the role of creativity in driving sort of innovation forward, how important, cultural activities are not just sort of separate by themselves. They must be fused with industry. And so it's this ability of creatively trained people, I think always, which is so powerful in imagining these futures, to look beyond what currently is, to do something, to imagine something better. Because so often people are sort of taught to think incrementally, but I think creative people can have great creative leaps. And actually, also remarkably, I think this can often take a level of naivety. People who have limited experience in any industry or sector are not constrained by the existing thinking and the existing practices. So these creative practices really matter, and creative people must recognize their abilities actually to contribute to these amazing futures. The problem, I think, is that it can actually be so hard to have the confidence to contribute to these foreign worlds. You know, when I worked with the National Health Service and the Department for Health in this country, or the Home Office, and I'll refer to this later on, I was sort of dealing with policymakers. I was thinking, what do I know about crime? What do I know about the large-scale health systems? But again, it was my naivety and the people I was collaborating with that could bring the new ideas to these places. So I thought that, look, one way to start with this is, and one way you can build confidence, is to see role models and pioneers, you know, those that have gone before. So I thought, let me give you 4 examples of fantastic designers, people trained as designers who are sort of innovators and sometimes sort of company chief executives now, that we've supported at PlusX over the past sort of 7 years or so. So firstly, on the left, we've got Lauren Bell. So she's sort of entered the world of healthcare innovation. Why? Because within her family, there are awful cases of eczema, and she knew that the current medical devices weren't good enough. So she's a graduate of Brunel University, a designer by training, and she's created products in a company called Cozy Care, which, you know, offers a range of fantastic eczema care devices, and she's going from strength to strength. On the right-hand side, we've got Lucy Hughes, product design graduate of Sussex University. And she, of course, is very concerned about single-use plastics, especially the transparent films that you find on kind of food packaging. So she's created Marinatex, you know, which is creating bioplastic from fish waste and from algae. Or 2 others. On the left, we've got Amrit, and next to him, on the left, we've got Carlton, and to his right, we've got Amrit. Now, Carlton is a graduate of sort of design for sustainability at Brunel University. And he and Amrit have created Acceleron, which is an amazing business looking at the reuse of lithium-ion batteries. Because let's face it, as wonderful as lithium-ion batteries may be in dealing with some of our sustainable energy storage challenges, to recycle lithium-ion batteries is difficult, and there's an awful lot that can be done with reuse. And I won't go into how they do it, but it's just a fantastically simple and wonderful creative idea that has spawned an amazing business. And on the right, we've got Rob and Rowan. These guys were trained as graphic designers at Kingston University, and they've taken potato waste and are turning it into bioplastic. So for me, this is just amazing that these people who are all trained as product designers or graphic designers or something like that are now doing things that you probably wouldn't have imagined they might be doing. But also importantly, I think, is while they've had the imagination to consider something, and again, like I said, the naivety to imagine that they could sort of create novel materials, at the same time, they can't do it by themselves. So one of the things we used to talk about a lot at IDEO, was the way in which no single skill set is enough. You need to bring together the worlds of design, yes, but also the worlds of business and the world of technology. And actually bringing this diverse thinking together is remarkably difficult because everyone has very different language, very different values, very different processes, very different ways of thinking. But you have to do it. You have to confront it. There is no other way to do it. So, for instance, you know, Rob and Rowan and others, you know, would be recruiting material scientists in order to drive their business forward. They created a commercial partnership between McCain, who make all those chips, and their company, because of course McCain has got so much potato waste. They're ideal for dealing with that waste stream and turning it into, you know, biodegradable plastics. So again, this form of collaboration is incredibly important, but collaboration is not easy, and we've got all these different ways of working, as I say. But actually, maybe the first question would be, how do I even find people to collaborate with in the first place? Now, one way in which you do that is you go and place yourself in a city, because there you might bump into people, right? And so the general theory always was, go to the big city, you'll find so many diverse people to collaborate with. That's the best way to get going. And indeed, the city where I started, God knows how many years ago, early 90s, was San Francisco, because Silicon Valley had become this rich place where you've got Stanford University joined by a kind of government research institute, Stanford Research Institute, then a corporate research institute, Xerox Park, the Palo Alto Research Center. Then you had, Heretakis as a sort of a corporate entity. We had the venture capitalists of Sandhill Road, and then we began to get the people in the garages, you know, the spin-outs from Hewlett-Packard and all the others building these amazing startups. So it was quite a journey, but it was this amazing place to be. And at least when I went in the early 90s, what had happened was many designers had started to come in there, many of them European actually from the 80s onwards, in order to consumerize the digital world. And that's really why we have all these consumer digital products now, because the creative people came in to create the brands and the consumer experiences to match with the engineers. So it was a very rich mix these days. But over the past 20 years, what's happened is that, you know, it's gone beyond San Francisco, right, to New York and Paris and London. But also what's really important is that if you take London, where 20, 30 years ago, we would have had innovation happening in a science park outside of London, you know, the places where only the scientists go, no creative people. Now what's happening is that the innovation districts are sort of happening in the center of town. And this is important, of course, because that's where the creative lives. So we all have heard, I'm sure, those of us that understand innovation in the UK and London of Silicon Roundabout, which was East London, Shoreditch. And the point is that was a relatively inexpensive bit of town where many creative people lived. And then side by side with the software coders, you begin to create this great mixture of the designers and the technologists, as I say, and also the business people. And so now with the innovation districts like in King's Cross, we've got Central St. Martin's just outside on the right of the picture, as well as UCL. You've got Google and Facebook as anchor corporates. You've got the venture capitalists, Balderton just south of here, Local Globe just north. And you've got the Crick Institute, that building in the sort of the mid left is a sort of premier scientific research institute that normally would have been out of town in a science park. So, you know, it's definitely happening in these cities where we're getting this rich mix of creativity as well as science, as well as business. But actually for me, what is even more important now is this is spreading beyond London. You know, this is a chart from a place called the Connected Places Catapult, and it's looking there at sort of the UK regional cities and where we're seeing all of these sort of innovation districts. And the reason why they're growing is because government, of course, wants to see thriving communities and well-paid jobs. Big business wants to collaborate with universities and startups. Universities want to train knowledge and commercialize ideas. Small businesses want to grow, and communities want rewarding work. In other words, if this is kind of high value jobs, then why wouldn't we do that? Because we deserve to have really exciting jobs everywhere in the company and well-paid jobs in the country, and every well-paid jobs as well. So that's, I suppose, why I'm based in Brighton, because, you know, after my career in design, I decided to get involved in the support for entrepreneurs, for innovators and entrepreneurs. And so we build innovation hubs. This particular one was very ably supported by many people in Brighton, including Nick Hibbert, that's going to be joining us for the panel session later. So, you know, we say now we're creating innovation hubs. To some extent, it's just an office building, but actually it's the way we sort of create a fantastic community of diverse perspectives and voices and practices, I think, that really matters, because ultimately what we're trying to do is grow great ideas to make sort of local economies more resilient and create some fantastic jobs at the same time. So how would you do this? Well, the first thing you would do, of course, is design a fantastic building. This was designed by Studio Eager at West. Lucas Lawrence actually studied at the University of Brighton. So this building screams creativity. It's a fantastic place to be, focused on well-being, and it just hopefully makes everyone think bigger, but certainly it makes them bump into one another because there's a kitchen or roof deck or an event space all over the place. So it's intentionally designed for people to bump together and to be able to collaborate. And more than that, it's got physical infrastructure in there so you can make things, because as we all know, with diverse practices, some people think by talking or just sitting and mulling things over. Some people think by making. And ultimately, making physical things is incredibly important, especially when we're dealing with, you know, issues of climate change or healthcare, as we'll come on to later. But not all making is physical. A lot of making is digital. So we've got podcasting studios, VR suites, that kind of stuff. Just the stuff where people can begin to experiment and collaborate. And again, sometimes communicating with one another can be through talking in this kind of space or making things side by side and showing them to people. And then beyond that, of course, actually, as I've referred to already, connecting with academics is important. And so we were delighted to be able to be supported by Coaster Capital and in partnership with the University of Brighton, because then we enable all the great thoughts and ideas that are in the university, and we connect it with all of the businesses as well. So really trying to create as diverse a community as possible in terms of its practices and its knowledge and the way in which it and the things it's trying to deal with. And so now we've got a community of about, getting towards 400 people. The building when full will be about 600 people. But not only, I'm not going to read all those things out there. Those are all, some of the people that are in the building. They're very, very broad. But for me, what was incredibly important is that, we opened in June 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And 18 months later, our main spaces are nearly 90% full. The community is buzzing. And the reason why throughout the pandemic, we were able to grow our community month on month is partly because we were able to operate the space very safely. But actually, each person was inspired by the positivity and the resilience of another, sharing connections, sharing ideas, sharing practical support, trading with each other, forming new companies together, providing skills, or just simple reassurance. Absolutely, this was a stressful and difficult time, but it was creating that critical mass was so important because, of course, Brighton is a relatively small space. So in theory, you can bump into people. But actually, what do we mean by critical mass? Actually, being in the same building, tripping over one another as one moves up through the building or goes down to the cafe. This is the kind of stuff that really creates those tight bonds and those tight connections, the forms of trust. So I suppose really as I sort of get to the end of this, sort of two final thoughts really. One message, I suppose, is fairly simple. If you are not part of a diverse set of communities, then perhaps you're missing out. If you consider yourself to be a creative practitioner, do you spend time with technologists and business thinkers, organizational design experts? Do you connect with students and research academics? How diverse are the practices in your networks? So whether it's through the talks and events put on by Always Possible, Wired Sussex, Platform 9, or Plus X, all the business support from University of Brighton, to name just a few things in the city of Brighton, there is so much to explore. The argument I would make is too often we don't push outside of our comfort zones and really start to collaborate with people whose languages we probably don't even understand. And then I suppose finally, to end with one final thought, is perhaps more of a question or a hope. One way diverse folks align is through a common cause, clearly. And for me, an innovation challenge is a great mechanism. For those of you that don't know, innovation challenges are saying, well, let's solve this problem. Who's up for it, really? It's as simple as that. It can come from government, it can come from industry. I led challenges as Chief Design Officer at the Design Council on improving health. That's why I work with the Department of Health. Reducing crime. That's why I work with the Home Office. Gaining employment and giving babies the best start in life. It's an amazing way to get new people with new teams coming together. And let's face it, we've got more challenges than ever before facing us, and we've just come through an amazing challenge that showed the power of collaboration, I think, and collective action. And Brighton as a creative and technical cluster, I think, has the power to generate world-beating ideas for the big issues of our time. So for me, what is our collective call to action? We know what, climate change, plastic pollution, rethinking social care, transforming the high streets. I think we could really rally around very clear challenges like this. And more than that, it's not just that Brighton has a fabulous range of creative leaders, technologists, and business leaders. But of course, these challenges here require a very systemic response and a very practical and physical response. Single point solutions, theoretical solutions aren't enough. How better to experiment with systems than in a city? So Brighton and Hove, for me, should be a place of innovation, not just because it's got the talent, but that as a small city, it can be used as a place to try things out and to kind of grow the best solutions. So ultimately, I suppose I was intrigued by these sessions, the conversations that might ensue, trying to ignite action. And so I readily agreed to come along, and I really look forward to the discussion we're going to have and hopefully to see what happens afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And I think one of the positives of our region is we are we are spoilt with the amount of groups and communities and conversations that are happening. And I think sometimes it can be quite daunting. Again, I'm going to go with my eternal trying to be positive about lockdown. For a lot of people, it meant they could dial into conversations. They could be walk into a virtual room and kind of build their confidence up. And I think for creatives, it is those baby steps, isn't it? Especially if you're working by yourself, you're freelancing, coming to co-working days, coming to events, and just finding your tribe. You know, we have lots of co-working spaces in Brighton Hove. They have different flavors, different communities. Find the one that fits with you.
And I think to your point, it's so important, but also find some other tribes you could collaborate with. But as you say, I think it's such an important point. What is the simplest, safest way for me to try it out and not feel intimidated and not feel it's inappropriate that I can join them because I'm not obviously from their tribe?
And as you say, do go to the ones that might be a little bit random. Go and find out who, because it might inspire you. I think it's quite. I mean, I love dialing into some weird and wonderful things during lockdown. Some things still are online, but I just have that. Try the spaces. Most have sort of events or free co-working. You know, go out and find, and then, as you say, go some different conversations. Obviously, we've got Phil from Wild Sussex joining us later. You know, there's lots of different conversations, from the deep geek to the spiritual to the creative. Get in all of them, and be open-minded to who you might meet. Now we have some questions for you. Question from Polly. Have there been examples yet of cross-fertilization between people from different types of practice in the building, leading to outcomes that might not have happened otherwise?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been an amazing one. So on the one hand, we've got a fantastic business that's quite well celebrated, quite rightly so, called Naught, which is all about really a fantastic bit of tech, the use of artificial intelligence to optimize GPS. So quite technical. GPS has inaccuracies. You can use AI essentially to make it more accurate. So you can measure distances this big rather than 10 meters. But Jack, who is one of the co-founders of Naught, sort of bumped into a fantastic colleague, someone else, who is from the world of real estate, and Michael, and Michael's from the world of real estate, very different in his worldview and where he was in his career, very much interested in searching for, I don't know, architectural contracts, actually, funny enough, helping small architectural practices to win new business. And now they formed a new company together using AI, funnily enough, to sort of analyze multiple data feeds to sort of automate many of the processes of finding jobs for architects. So it's a brilliant case, because I think people from very different sectors, actually very different life stages, perhaps, or career stages, suddenly going, hey, let's do something together. So there are actually quite a few examples like that.
And I think sometimes having a creative mindset, looking at a very technical challenge or a very technical solution, can bring new ideas, new routes to market. It is all about sparking that different perspective. Another question from Dan for you. How do you engage with the wider local community with different ideas to make use of their ideas and talent outside of those in the business community? Yeah,
I would say it's something we've not done nearly well enough yet. And I think partly that was because of lockdown, because we might think of getting people together physically. And actually, one of the things we really want to do this year is to engage much more widely. On the one hand, actually, often one very sort of obviously powerful thing one can do is to bring in the sort of students, those people that might be wondering, what do I want to do in the world? How can I be inspired? So definitely working with Brighton Aldridge Academy, Community Academy, and others. But I think in general, that's one thing. We'd love ideas. If people have got great ideas about how can we do things that feel like they've got a wider applicability, then let's do something. And sometimes we've done things, as simple things like over the sort of pre-Christmas period, laser cut some Christmas decorations in the workshops. Maybe that's a rich enough idea. Maybe it's not. We'll be very open to ideas.
We're just all moving onto your roof terrace for the summer, Matt. It's wonderful up there.
Come on in.
Thank you very much.
Bar.
Oh no, that's it. We're all there. Thank you very much. On to our next speaker, Lefteris.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to see the common threads between the presentations. It's really enjoyable. So this time we're going to focus on design education. Let me just get my presentation. Okay. So basically, we're going to talk about art and design education challenges. But first, I'm going to sort of tell you a bit about me. I'm Lefteris. I've been drawing and painting for a long time. And I've also been a musician for a very long time. Currently, I am a designer, I'm an educator, and I'm also a podcaster. So a little bit of context. What I'm going to say is about the visual art and design education. And approximately, even things are very different, but generally we're going to sort of get to the spirit of challenges all over the world. And we're going to talk in a global context. And I don't necessarily have answers. I think, we have a lot of questions, and maybe from the questions we can sort of go to the answers. So about over 10 years ago, I started this reflexive research, wanting solutions to design education challenges. This research involves, well, it's still going on, of course, the three stakeholders, the universities, the students, and the industry, and that relation that is so much misunderstood in many ways. Out of that research, many years later, came the first design education forum. With what is different about the design VDEF is that it's focused on practice-based. About practice-based applicable solutions. So it's not about research so much, research-heavier papers, but we're looking for applicable solutions from practitioners that can be applied immediately. And so far, last November, I just finished the third one, and I'm in the process of preparing the fourth one right now. Out of these fora came a podcast called Design Education Talks that actually bridges the gap between these events and talks about the challenges of design education. And so far we've had the 64 episodes that have been published, and it's available on YouTube and on many podcast platforms. Also, I'm the host of Designer Talks podcast, a podcast that focuses on the personality of designers. So again, we have some designers in the audience, might be of interest to them as well. So this is a very nice quote from Daniel Priestley. Our best thinking 5 years ago is our baggage today. So we really have to focus, of course, on what's been happening, but also rethink and not stop sort of researching. So part of my exploration is these three stages in design education about how students are before, how they are before coming, during their education, and after these three stages. And right now, the arts are under attack everywhere. So this journey needs to be evaluated as of course schools are cutting more and more into the art and design courses. And again, the degrees have changed, and things are tend to be merging quite a bit, even though we still have separate specialisms. But the outlook is that that students need to also have their awareness on a much broader range of specializations. So again, one of the things that has suffered tremendously in the past, let's say, less than 20 years is contact time, that has been reduced. And that is something that, again, we need to look at. Another thing that is not happening as much is drawing. And again, we have to really look at that and see how that can be applied and allow students time to do that as a practice, as a foundation for creative practices. So we need to evaluate the student journey and think in terms of a much wider time frame. not look at the very short-term gains, but look at the wider time frame and on how industry can be implemented, how we can implement the industry into the education, so the student journey can be more geared towards that. Again, so how can education support the future of art and design? So this is something that, again, this is a question. It's very open-ended for the audience as well. And how can we support? That's another challenge during the pandemic, and of course right now, is online or offline apprenticeships. So something that we could support students with. So really, for me, the greatest gift of education is to allow students to be themselves, and that's something that we need to really invest on and promote. Thanks so much.
Hey, Lefteris, you whizzed through that. I was really interested in you saying about drawing and time. Do you think students are really impacted by the amount of noise they have with social media and phones?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mm.
The focus is not there, but again, it's a practice, and of course there are many things that can be said, about that. But again, in our space, I just wanted to give the flavor and not, so that we have time for questions and dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also the impact, as you said, of the last 2 years of not getting able to get together and build communities in person and build the joy of being in the studio, drawing that energy that you get when you're with other people, whether you say whatever sort of space it is. As creatives, it's wonderful to be there with that energy in a room full of other people making and doing.
Well, thank God that this has come back in the UK now, so we are fully back
We
on that.
appreciate it. You don't know what you've got till it's gone, do you?
Yeah.
We may not miss the commute, but we do miss seeing the people when we get there. No, absolutely. If we can get back to that, but again, do it differently. What essence do we lose, and how do we get that back in maybe a different way?
The thing is that a lot of decisions are taken, without the participation of the ones that are being impacted. So this is, the dialogue needs to not be on a two-tier, but it needs to be in the same room, because a lot of decisions right now are made without us, but are impacting us tremendously. Both the students, of course, which is the number one priority, and of course,
Yeah.
The lecturers.
Yeah, exactly. Ask your community. Don't make hierarchical decisions up there. Thank you, Lefteris. And last but by no means least, Jessica. Well, wait 1 second, Lefteris. We have a question for you for Richard before you go. Do current creative students have different ideas or expectations about where they might work in the future?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's more about connecting. It's not just about the future, it's connecting the past to the future so they can understand the journey. What students do not understand is because they've been born with the internet. Yeah. So they don't understand all the journey and where all this has come from. I mean, we don't have to, of course, talk about, the horse and the fantastic, tremendous carriage that was the first camera. Of course not. But at the same time, we got to link the past to the present so that the future can be understood. The students, depending on their level of awareness, some students are fantastically prepared and are very much on board. So the key to that is to understand the amount of commitment that needs to take place.
Thank you. Sorry to pull you in there. Jessica, I'm very sorry about that as well. I just thought the question was so of the moment there. But last but not least, Jessica, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. What a wonderful set of conversations.
We've gone down a lot of different avenues, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. I feel like I've been pulled in many different forms. This is great. So I've got lots of really interesting questions later on. But yes, I'm here to talk to you about kind of my journey and my experience on clusters, communities, and co-working spaces. I will just share my screen with you now. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, looking good.
Wonderful. So yes, hello. I am Jess. This is me at the age of about 5 or 6. I don't quite know the age. But yeah, I'm here today to talk to you about communities, clusters and co-working spaces and how that's kind of impacted my career. I was born with a disability called cerebral palsy, and I don't know how many people know about CP, but it's a result from a lack of oxygen at birth kind of to the brain. But yeah, this is me at about 5 or 6, but it hasn't, because I've lived with CP, I kind of only can really experience, like, know what it's like to live with disability, not kind of live as opposed to living non-disabled. I studied a BA in product and furniture design at Kingston University, and shortly after I graduated, I kind of knew that I wanted to forge my own career. I focused kind of my best way, so after leaving, I kind of focused on how best I could set up a business. And so I kind of joined with lots of different charities and organizations, and I found a kind of 12-week business bootcamp course, which I signed up to, and basically the course started kind of, you were able to, there was about 25 people and kind of cash funding prize at the end of the course to basically kickstart your company. But yeah, I kind of launched into it not really thinking that I would win or I'd be able to get secure funding, and later, you know, lo and behold, I win my first kind of cash funding prize, and that's where it all kind of begins really for me. I started kind of when I finished university, I didn't want to launch straight into kind of job, finding a job. So I started working freelance on kind of a number of projects, this one included, just to kind of enable myself to suss out the kind of sort of area that I wanted to work in. I knew that I wanted to specialize and work with young people who identified as disabled, working and creating in the creative sectors. And so I connected with charities and companies like A New Direction, just to kind of get my foot in the door really. A New Direction, just to give you a bit of background on who they are, they have a growing network of creative champions which work with deaf, disabled and neurodiverse young people from across London. Their SEND network is a free professional development programme for London special schools, teachers and mainstream Senkos. I actually started working with them as part of their, they were holding a creativity works kind of design course, which was like another kind of full throttle, just in a very short amount of time, you know, learning how to get your foot in the door basically to, you know, work with design agencies. So I joined them to kind of gain further opportunities for myself. I was then able to get some freelance work with them later on, that where I was able to kind of work more one-on-one with children and young people with SEND, so special educational needs and disabilities. And so I blogged and reported on a number of projects with them, and the specific ones that I've got, I'll show you a photo of, just kind of seemed to stick with me really. I find that freelancing with the Special Schools Network at the Tate Exchange as part of the A&D Inclusive event was a real kind of incredible insight just into understanding, capturing and learning the strengths and weaknesses, you know, people with different abilities face on a daily basis. What I loved about here is that there was kind of like a community that existed that I didn't know personally, I didn't know it existed until I kind of wedged my foot in the door. And so the community is like a kind of, yeah, there was a really kind of lovely way of a kind of cluster development that got going. kind of through all these schools, SEND schools, that knew each other, working in these great big kind of orgs like the Tate Exchange. I find that storytelling is a really powerful tool, which we can use in any medium. But for me, when I write, you know, I can kind of, I feel like sitting down with a child, like I feel a bit more free and direct in how I share information, whether that's kind of sitting with a child who's nonverbal and learning how to kind of understand how they communicate through touch, emotion, or sound, or if it's a child sitting in front of me that I have to kind of look at and respond to physically with a 3D object. What was so great about this opportunity is that it created space for me to learn and just to observe, you know, how children with SEND adapt and learn within these different environments and challenges that kind of they face as well. I personally like to focus more on one-on-one work. So for me, I feel like I gained the kind of privilege, you know, an insight, even if it was just for a short, you know, couple of days into the lives of these children, which was very, very special for me. I find that the creative world is very unique in that sense. Kind of, it takes a very simple approach, you know, like kind of, you know, allowing a building space and having, you know, all these kids just occupy the space for a week, and, you know, that they can kind of run riot and do what they want to do, obviously, in, you know, kind of in the parameters of not kind of injuring oneself. But yeah, I feel like it's very unique in that sense. Kind of, it takes a very simple approach and applies it to kind of everyday activities. I was recently invited to be part of the Creative Industries Federation cohort. This is a federation that look to kind of creating change across the creative sectors, just to give better support to freelancers. I'm a freelancer myself, and they help kind of support freelancers to ensure a more equal, there's more that there's more of an equal relationship between freelancers, brands, and institutions, and how they kind of work together. What was so lovely is that when they approached me, I was kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited, you know, thank you so much for thinking of me. And I was really interested to find out more, because it's a group made up of 15 individuals, all from very, very, very different backgrounds. And you might, some faces might be familiar to you here. But we have a collective aim, which is that over the months, you know, we've been working to try and kind of change policy within the creative sectors, just to kind of make it a bit more inclusive. So I guess you could say that the work that we've been doing here, there's a sort of cluster that's been formed out of the 12, 15 of us. We all kind of bring very different strengths, but as a collective, we're aiming to make the creative sector, the creative freelance sector, more inclusive. Around a similar sort of time to when I was approached by Creative Federation, I was also invited to work with Stage Text. If you don't know who they are, they're a deaf-led charity working to make culture more accessible to everyone. Working with Stage Text and the Federation, I don't think would have come up for me if I hadn't been at the right place at the right time. And for this, I'm incredibly grateful for. I think when working within the creative sector, yes, it's about knowing who's who, but it's also about how you can further take those opportunities yourself, to kind of create new pathways and new collaborations for you, or for yourself in the future, that can then lead to kind of external jobs. earlier this year, I actually carried out some work as a teaching assistant to a very cute reception class, and kind of the kids were about 4 or 5 years old, just because I wanted to broaden my learnings and kind of work out what it was like to work with children, specifically in an education setting with SEN in schools. It kind of took me back to my old school days, because when I was younger in school, kind of primary, secondary, I was in a mainstream school. I started in a mainstream school, and then it wasn't until the years like 6 I transferred into a SEN school. So a school that kind of worked more closely with people who were dyslexic and dyspraxic. So in this school, I was actually assisting a child who had quite severe autism in a mainstream environment. And I quickly realised, what the kind of challenges that are actually faced, the challenges that teachers and Senkos face very early on in education. At that age, you don't really realise how valuable having that one-to-one support can be until you leave the education system to like university. So for me, it was a parallel experience, kind of putting things into context and perspective, which has also been a really important step kind of in my developmental career, kind of not growing up as a disabled child. My parents didn't treat me any differently. They were just kind of like, okay, here you go, throw you in at the deep end and see how far you can go. So yeah, kind of making that switch from mainstream to SEN is a very different kind of shocking switch in a good way. So for me, having those two different perspectives on education, I feel has enabled me to do the work that I can do now. I feel like, I've actually just staying here, I feel like there needs to be, I feel like inclusion and disability studies need to be taught as part of mainstream education within the curriculum, because I feel like there's always a disconnect that happens between when a child or young person leaves the education system and then goes into kind of employment. There's always, I feel like there's not enough teachings that happen early on in education about SEN, SEND children. So I think there's a need to be a bit of a remodeling and restructuring. And I mean, I'm still, learning what those areas could look like. This is my kind of first little teaching job that I had. I'm very grateful that a lot of my work has been kind of picked up, you could say, by media outlets. When you work in the creative sectors, you feel a sense of community, because everyone's always you find that everyone's working in quite a similar area to you, which means that you can develop quite a wide range of kind of coverage in the media. I've been very fortunate that my work has been picked up by companies like Creative Life and Progress, and it's nice that, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart, because without these articles and features, I don't think I would be kind of where I am today in my kind of journey or career. Just to kind of give you a bit of a snapshot, really a bit about this slide of the work that I started doing, kind of how I got into what I do. I launched a pop-up shop in Peckham, which was a community-led project I created out of my first funding block, where I invited designers and creatives to collaborate on projects. From there, I then received further funding, where I was able to design some hackathons, which I'll show you later on. And whilst I was here, I was kind of picked up by lots of different press. So it's just kind of making the the conversation, around how important and how crucial and grateful, I am, and it is to kind of have, yes, kind of have all these events that you hold, but also the kind of ripple effect that they can make for you. So just to kind of give you an idea from this pop-up shop and the work that I was doing just as I'd left university, I was able to give lots of kind of talks. So I was invited to talks by the Design Museum, done some small projects as well with their Design Ventura kind of cohort. I had a lovely, the Dots and Squarespace announced me as one of their creative leaders with a social heart. I was in the Creative Learning Progress. And this is one of the first articles that I was published in the big issue. I do have a little video, if there's time at the end to show, but this was a...
Yeah, go for it, Jessica, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see if it can work. You might have to bear with me.
It worked in practice, which is always, tempting fate.
Yes, let me know if you can hear this. Good. I'll stop it there because you kind of get the gist of the end of that video. But yes, that was kind of that was a project. Back to my file. Big screen. So that was a project that we did as part of a. We're kind of doing some work. I was doing some work with a New Direction on a different project. And we did this at the Machines Room in East London. But yeah, just kind of to give you a bit of talking about kind of the co-working elements that I've done with my design hackathons that I was talking to you about before. This is a kind of space that I was working at. I was working at a space called Soapbox Islington. We were invited to, or we were kind of allowed to use their 3D workshop, and they had like a kind of everything. It was like a co-working space. So I was teaching young adults from main cap, little product design workshops. And these are some of the outcomes that were made, just to kind of give you a bit of an idea. But yeah, thank you, that's me.
That was great, Jessica. My mum's in a wheelchair, and I love the fact they went through all the different versions of it, and because you can over design something, and sometimes it was a really simple idea, but it's
Yeah,
just test
exactly.
and try.
Exactly. And I think there was lots of different, I mean, that was probably out of like 100 products that we tested. So yes, it's very, it's a trial and error.
I find I've learned a lot about disability because of my mum, and it just feels like the world is designed by non-disabled people. The wheelchairs, I mean, we won't even start on sort of the sort of the standard NHS wheelchairs. My mum's got a cool off-roader, but you just think these people have never sat in this, and you look at the pavements, you look at the shops, and
Yeah, and you kind of, you think to yourself that if you had the opportunity to kind of work with the end user, then surely it would beg for better design, a better design outcome. And that's kind of what I'm like, that's what I strive for in my work, and the reasoning why, I do everything that I do, just to kind of get lots of different perspectives.
User experience seems to be completely lost on most disability products that I've experienced so far. Yeah, and I don't think it's difficult. I just think it's having the conversations, as you say. There's a whole conversation about inclusivity there and understanding, which I loved what you're talking about in schools. And there's a great question actually from Steph on this about your parents' attitude to your disability. I love you said your parents it was just you. It's just who you were. Let's not put a badge on it, because again, I think disability is a badge that has negative connotations. It's celebrating our differences, isn't it?
Exactly. And I have cerebral palsy, and yes, I have quite bad short-term memory, but I get by with whatever comes. And I think, sadly my mum passed away 10 years ago, but I feel like my mother was always pushing to kind of try and make me kind of not try and fit into a certain box, but to just do whatever I could, and having grown up within a mainstream setting before I went into specialized kind of special education, I think really it was a really I kind of commend them for doing that so early on, because as I was saying in my talk, working with this child that I was working with in this mainstream school, it kind of brought up all the challenges and all the difficulties, but also all the kind of celebrations that we still need to kind of, all the little wins,
You have a unique perspective on the world. Surely that's a good thing. Again, I think it's just flipping the narrative. Something I've become very passionate about over the last 20 years, because again, you don't know what you don't know. I now have experience. And how we take it back to the beginning and have a more inclusive conversation about it. Now I'm going to bring everybody back. So we're going to now have the panel, because Polly, I've got your question then. I wanted to bring on Nick Hibbard, who's Executive Director for Economy, Environment and Culture at Brighton and Hove City Council, and Phil Jones, Managing Director of Wired Sussex. And Nick, I'm going to throw Polly's question at you. A great question, picking up from Cissie's interesting position. Is there enough connectivity and porous edges in our ecology for Matt and Jessica's worlds to come together? And who are the facilitators who can support that? And I'm not going to say it's Brighton Hove City Council's job to facilitate that, but what are your thoughts?
I think it's a really good question, and thanks, Lucy, and thanks to everyone that's spoken so far tonight. I think what's I've been reflecting on just listening to you all is that in Brighton, when we think about clusters and we think about co-working spaces, I think we've done quite well, and we have a lot of the ingredients in place. But the bit that's perhaps missing is how we use spaces to create communities. And Matt reflected on, it's not about just creating buildings, it's about creating communities. And I know that in one of the questions, I think Cissie said, what's Brighton, or who is Brighton's ecology conducive to? or conducive for. So, and I think if we were to ask ourselves, we probably have been quite successful at creating clusters and creating innovation systems. And we've been quite successful at intervening to provide public subsidy to facilitate that and to help that. But if we were to ask ourselves who they are for and who's benefiting from that, we're probably not benefiting all of our communities. So in terms of diversity, inclusiveness, and thinking about how we recover culturally, which for me is about connecting people in place, then there's probably a lot more to do to make sure that we're connecting all of our communities and really reaping the benefits of all of the communities that we have in the city that can be so creative and innovative and entrepreneurial. So I think there's somewhere to go there, reflecting on what people have been saying today.
Matt, it looks like you have an opinion on that. You have your hand up.
Yeah, well, firstly, completely agree with what Nick was saying there. I think there's a lot more we can do, and certainly we felt constrained by the pandemic and the lockdown, the nervousness of getting together physically, in not being able to reach out as much. And so we certainly plan to do that much more. And to answer Polly's question directly, yeah, well, the basic agents are Jessica and me to have a chat and work out what we can do together. Because already there are a large number of links. If you want to talk about porosity, actually, you've got to work out how small the world is like this. So Daniel Charney, the founder of Fixperts, just to pick two examples. Daniel Charney, the founder of Fixperts, has a hand in the root of the concept of +X. And secondly, Machines Room, where that video was shot, was led by my sister, Nat. And Gareth, who was the workshop manager, came and built our workshop in +X. So we're very interconnected. We have Jess Hills, a physical disability inclusion coordinator within +X. So let's set something up, Jessica. You know, I think there's lots we can do.
Thank you, Matt. Phil, over to you.
Yeah, and I just want to actually respond to Polly's question, but also reflect on what Nick has just said as well. So I think, you know, it is possible to bring together those two worlds, the highly kind of creative artist and the economic benefit, the economic value of it. But it's not easy. That's the truth of the matter. So, you know, Wired Sussex has been supporting co-working spaces in the city for many years. I mean, we helped the first and original co-working space in the city, the Skiff, get off the ground, and we run what we call a collaborative R&D space now called the Fuse Box. And the idea behind the Fuse Box was to apply creative practices and creative thinking to the development and utilization of emerging technologies. So to bring to bear on some of these new technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, super connectivity, and the big data, to bring to bear a creative mindset to that and help that develop. And you can do that, but it's very, very difficult because typically in the technology world, you don't apply a creative mindset. I think you apply a much more linear approach to it. You have sprints, you have minimum viable products, you have timelines that you have to develop the technology in. Whereas the creative mindset is much more about play, going down dead ends, finding new ways to do things, and learning by engaging with others. You know, it's the classic, what we've lost in this country, actually, I think, is art schools. You know, we should bring back art schools in this country because so much great stuff came from the art schools of the 60s, 70s and 80s. So, you know, if we were going forward, we'd bring back art schools, I think, and apply them more generally across society. In terms of Nick's point, it strikes me that we really, it feels like we really ask a lot of our creative community. You know, Matt talked about the economic impact of the creative industries, and it's, you know, clearly seen, you know, in the UK economy as a success story. We see them as central to the health of places now, the cultural health of places. We see them as being important in terms of levelling up and helping new places catch up or develop. So we ask an enormous amount of our creative communities. I wonder whether we give enough back to them to support them. So clearly, you know, in our schools, it feels like sometimes the creative subjects are being reduced in scope and being demeaned. I think we haven't got the reward systems right for creative communities as well. I've been working with, recently we've been working with the local music industry, and artists do not get a fair return through streaming services on their creative product. So in many ways, I think as a country, you know, and I'd love to see Brighton leading on that, we need to be fairer to our creative communities if we're asking so much of them.
Lefteris, over to you.
Yeah, Phil, I really enjoyed your input.
Thank you.
So how, because that's what my talk was exactly about, what you're saying. So how can we bring back the art schools? How can we, this is the whole point.
Can I jump in here?
Oh, go on, Cissie,
Sorry.
yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yes, to Lefteris's point and also to Phil's point, also maybe a bit of a caveat, and I think Lefteris actually pointed to it. There's something inherent in education, which is also a structure and a system, right? So insofar as we're talking about teaching art entrepreneurship, I think we're already formalizing something in a way that is replicating some of the authority structures and the dominant structures that are already in place, which creates the kind of values and currency that Phil is talking about. So yes, there is a fairness that comes with compensation, but we have also lost the diversity of what values can be and who gets to define them. So insofar as we're looking at a monetary system, so I'm thinking about NFTs, like, is that going to change the world? Is it going to democratize the art world? Maybe not if we're thinking about access and inclusivity, right? And that's Jessica's point. So just a caveat as we continue this strand of conversation.
Nick, I think your hand was up next.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got the answer to bringing back art schools, but I would say that we do have a lot of the ingredients already in place in Brighton, and it's thinking about how do we make the most of those, but also how do we intervene where there's weaknesses. So if you think about it, we've got both universities, you know, which have art schools within them or creative elements of learning within them. We've got huge numbers of creatives and entrepreneurs, digital skills, and creative talent. So we've got the talent really, and we have the ecosystem and networks already there. We probably have access to quite a bit of finance, so that there is funding available. Certainly, if you were to look at whether it's public funding in terms of the Arts Council, we probably get higher levels of funding per head of population than almost anywhere in the country. Probably not enough, but we do get funding. So funding's there, and there's often, as Matt and Phil will know, there's often private funding available. We need to ensure that there's space for people to be able to come together, to be creative, to create communities, as Matt said, and there's a massive role for government and local government to play in that. And the Fuse Box involved public subsidy. Plus X involved public subsidy. The new dance space that's just being fitted out and is completed involved public subsidy. So in those situations, we've got to ensure that we work out how we get all of the ingredients to create clusters, ecosystems, innovation districts in place, and we focus on where we can intervene together. I suppose my point was that within all of those ingredients, we still need to make sure that we pay a lot of attention to inclusivity and diversity, because if we don't, we miss key elements of innovation and creativity that can come out of the city and generate new value.
Let me come to Matt and Phil first, because one of the things I wanted to bring in is Brighton becoming a victim of his own success in terms of we're trying to attract creatives, but the cost of all these co-working spaces, the fact that so many spaces are being turned into housing. We're opening Soho House in Brighton. Where do creatives who don't have that sort of income, how do they get engaged? Because it all looks lovely, but are we losing our creatives now to Worthing rather, to Eastbourne, and people are moving out of Brighton because it's not affordable for creatives to work there?
I mean, go on, Matt. So.
No, I'm not sure I can answer that question very well, except I suppose here I find myself 30 years into my career, suddenly being part of the world of sort of regeneration and real estate. And I suppose I think to myself, the word gentrification is often used to express the way in which the evolution of a place can overshoot or overheat. In some ways, it was argued very much in Shoreditch that that's what happened. And I must admit, I don't have any particularly good, answers to that. And maybe we'll go back to Nick, and he might. But I wanted also to react to those earlier questions, because I think it's linked actually around design and art schools. So I must admit, I'm very confused and very troubled because, on the one hand, the Financial Times lists all the careers, all the sort of the training you can have, and the ROI, the return on investment you create. And of course, medicine is at the top. Physics, weirdly, was very near the bottom, and the creative arts is right at the bottom. And I'm kind of going, wait a sec, how are you defining this? Because I can see people generating huge amounts of value with their creativity. And secondly, the following day almost, the Royal College of Arts was sort of lauded as the academic institution with the most entrepreneurs in the UK. It was almost bizarre. And then really sort of linking that through. So in other words, there's a very sort of potentially narrow and I think sort of mismodeled financial articulation. So bringing that back to art schools, I was sitting on a panel some years ago with, unfortunately, I won't remember the name, famous art school leader of the 1960s, 1970s. So picking up on Phil Jones's point, and he made the point, I suppose it was because of the time of the punk era, it was about anarchy. And the whole point about, some creative processes, they're almost anarchistic or wild in the way that they revolutionize. And I think I will willingly admit that sort of my thread of creativity at this point is channeled towards sort of commerce and problem solving and all that kind of stuff. It sounds very, 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 very linear, but I completely respect the fact that art school at its best can channel towards that kind of commercial outcome that better evolves, as Phil was describing, that better brings different ways of thinking to that otherwise overly linear model of innovation. But at the same time, art schools will only truly come back, I think, if you truly respect the sort of eclecticism and anarchy and wildness of what is possible in art schools. And I'm just not sure that value system is very present at this point.
And I think we have to celebrate, as Jess was saying, about creativity and play and mind expanding, and not every artist becoming an entrepreneur. That's not the headspace of a lot of people that we're talking to, and nor should it be. And I think we have to celebrate alternative approaches to what creativity in those communities and clusters should be. It's not all about setting up your own business. Nick, can I come to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of your question about is Brighton are we pricing people out? Is it becoming too expensive? I mean, it absolutely is the case that Brighton's an expensive city, and yet we have a low wage economy, and that's a real challenge. And now we have a cost of living crisis on top of that. I don't always necessarily see the sort of just the sense of gentrification. What I see is Brighton being an incredibly popular place, and that naturally having an impact in terms of the cost of space, etc. And it's just as popular with those people that don't have money as it is with those people that do. And that's something to do with the natural assets and the cultural economy and the creative economy that we have here. And people want to come here, whether they have the means to live here or not. And that puts a huge, huge pressure on space. I think we're about to enter another phase of thinking about how we prioritise space in the city. So we've spent probably the last 10 years, we focused a lot on building housing. trying to build more affordable housing. That hasn't made a difference to addressing the housing crisis, despite some successes there, and trying to ensure that we build alongside that some good quality office space. I think the next 10 years needs to think about who our development is for. And that will mean thinking about pushing developers a lot more to be able to provide cheaper, more affordable, more accessible creative spaces within the city. Otherwise, we will lose creatives to outside of the city. And I think how we do that in terms of our planning policies, in terms of our expectations of developers, and about thinking about how we use empty spaces in the city to address things like the systemic changes in retail will be really important over the next 10 years.
Yeah, London Road is quite shocking. You've got, Plus X is beautiful next to some of the poorest areas of Brighton, and it's how you blend and get those people to come and be in your space, Matt. There's some of those conversations to have. Jessica, I think your hand was up next.
Yeah, no, I was, am I on off mute? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to pick up on some points that I heard. I mean, I'm kind of London based, so I'm not Brighton based, but even in London, when I was looking for accessible spaces, because all of my work, is around disability and inclusion, I need to kind of be able to have those areas to find spaces that are, wheelchair accessible. And the way that I was working early on in my kind of career is that I was trying to find disused, unused spaces that you kind of, you kind of had that peer exchange as opposed to like renting out a space for money. And all of those areas, those settings that I came across, none of them were wheelchair accessible at all. So even just like, it's just the most obvious thing for me, it should be the most obvious thing for everyone, but just thinking in terms of those very little buildings in London that are non-accessible, and the ones that are, you have to pay big bucks for, is something that needs to kind of change. And it's something that I was talking in my presentation about working with the Creative Industries Federation. We're trying to create a big body here to kind of to allow for creatives of any age to access areas that they can, without shelling out thousands of pounds. So yeah, that was just
that links nicely into Steph's question actually to you around how people when you were trying to find spaces, were they open and inviting? So when you found one that you could get in from wheelchair perspective, how easy was it then to secure that?
Difficult, challenging. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the easiest of things, because the buildings that were wheelchair accessible were brand spanking new buildings. So you kind of needed to give something or offer something, as opposed to just being able to use it kind of how you want it. I mean, when I say use it how you want it, as a designer, you kind of want to, you don't not necessarily, create a huge mess in an area, but you want to be as creative as you can in the space, and you can't really do that in a space that is being specially designed and fit for kind of purpose, because there's all these like barriers that get put up in your way, saying, oh no, you can't do this here, or no, you can't do that there, or you can't create this mess, or you can't kind of there's lots of can'ts and very little cans.
Phil, over to you. Sorry for your patience there. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, and I was just thinking, the Fuse box has loads of fantastic equipment there. It has VR equipment, AR equipment, 5G test bed, all that kind of stuff. And it's that equipment that attracts people, I think, often to come to the space and use the space in the first place. But it's the community of people there that means they stay. And I think Matt probably finds the same thing, because Plus X has got brilliant kit. People come to use the kit, but actually finding a community of like-minded and sometimes not like-minded people, you know, that you can engage with, challenge, talk to, learn from, is what makes those places sustainable, I think, in the long term. And you know, if we are going to start losing that to the city, in that people can't afford to come here, then that is a significant problem. But Nick also raises a problem that is almost hidden from us, is that sometimes these spaces and places aren't accessible to parts of the population. And you know, if the digital sector and the creative industry sector becomes successful, and becomes even more successful than it is now, but certain social groups feel left out of that success, I think that's a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for social disaster. So I do agree with Nick that that's where we need to place a lot of effort. We need to recognise that there's a lot of talent in this city that isn't given the same resources and opportunities than other people. So I think that's right. And I think, you know, what we think about the Fuse box as a space to grow. And you know, I think what Nick's talking about is conceptualizing the whole city as a space to grow, which seems a kind of really generous and positive way to think about it.
But it's how, I guess the question to end on, which I don't think we can answer, is how we create this front door to Brighton and Hove for creatives, of where to go and how to engage and how to find your tribe, and for every sort of flavour of creative, so that we do create an inclusive cluster. I don't think we have an answer for that in the next 2 minutes, but that's our challenge, isn't it? Nick, over to you. We'll leave you that as your challenge, Nick. There you go.
No, well, I think it's a challenge for the whole sector, and you know, to sort of bringing it back to recovery. If you think about the cultural recovery plan, which the sector has produced, not the council, the sector has produced that together. Then, if you go back to the values and the principles of that plan, then they are values and principles that I think we would all hold dear, and so might the city. So I think it's there for us, really. And of course, one of those sort of key actions or objectives is space to grow. It's just one of them. But just if you think about the values, just to read them out: democracy, equity, leadership, creativity, generosity, trust. And then within that, making sure we're looking at things through the lenses of inclusion, children and young people, digital, environmental sustainability. I mean, they're just a few, but I just think that actually the sector has itself come up with some of the guiding principles, which if we follow, will stand us in good stead.
Yeah, we need spaces to collaborate, to create, to be messy. I like what Jessica said, you know, we need spaces to inspire all of this across generations, from schools through to those who come to Brighton because of its energy, and through to those who are very passionate about the you know, our city, as many of you are on this call. We're going to wrap up there. I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers and to our panel. It was a good debate I'd hoped it would be, and such amazing perspectives. I think, Cissie, you set the tone so powerfully, and then we went off on different tangents with Matt and Lefteris and Jessica. It's been a really intense 2 hours, lots of food for thought. I feel like we all need to go away and do something now, and go and start a community and start different conversations. But thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening, and we're going to send everyone who's been on here an evaluation form. It'd be lovely to get your feedback about what you enjoyed today and what you'd like to see from us next. And we want these conversations to continue. So please do head to cultureinourcity.com, where you can listen back to the other 3 of these sessions, which, Cissie, you summarised so beautifully at the beginning. You gave us a nice positioning of everything as well. And we look forward to seeing you again soon, basically. Thank you all very much and have a good evening.